To introduce Jennifer Flatt. She is an educator and a writer, and after earning her PhD in English, she began teaching English and Spanish full-time at the University of Wisconsin in Marinette. She currently serves as the Vice President of Student Affairs at Northeast Technical College in Wisconsin, and her career has focused on helping students access and successfully complete the college credentials of their choice. She has always been a writer, but Ungrieving, a memoir of emotional abuse, loss, and relief, is her first published book. Jennifer is also a reader, a baseball fan, and a mom to two boys, Anton and Edward. She lives in Marinette, Wisconsin with her husband Jason in the Victorian home that they are restoring. So it is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Flatt to you all today.
Thank you. And I didn't think to ask if it matters where I stand for the Zoom. Does it matter? Okay, good. I am just honored to be here today. I'm grateful to all of you who are present physically here, who are present on the Iron Mountain campus, and certainly anyone joining us via Zoom. Just as a quick reminder then, and we knew that this might happen because this is the way life goes. Oh, you had frozen it so that no one accidentally moved it. That is so brilliant. So just as a reminder, today's talk will include stories and conversation about depression and suicidal thinking. So I want to make sure that anyone physically present here in the room or present via Zoom or at the Iron Mountain campus via Zoom knows that if anything today is triggering for you, you certainly 24/7 have access to the suicide prevention line at 988. In addition to that, as was mentioned already, we have Michael present here in Escanaba. We have Amber and Brittany, who are both available at different times and in different locations. And then, and that QR code would take you there. And then we have Renee right here as well. And I just want to emphasize too that if anything triggers you today, the most important thing is to talk to someone today. Not to take it home with you and to try to grapple with that alone or to say, you know, someday I should tell someone about this. You should share that today, and then hopefully that person will be able to start you on a journey of healing and healthiness. One of the big messages and one of the big reasons why I wrote this book and why I'm sharing it is because my dad suffered from depression and did not get the help that he needed, and that had a tremendous impact on me, my sister, my mom, and everyone that knew him, and certainly on him. He did not get to live the life that he deserved to live because he did not get the help that he deserved to have. I did get help, and I got a lot of help. And so I wrote the book because I want other people to know it's okay to talk about these things. And in fact, it's okay to put them out there in the universe, and good things can come of doing that. And there is no shame in doing that. So today, what I'd like to do is share, I'll read parts of the book, I'll talk a little bit about it. I've created a PowerPoint that has some photos on it so that it's a little bit more interesting maybe, because you get to look at some pictures of different stages, but they're all of me pretty much, so I don't know if that's not the same thing. Anyway, I'm going to start by reading the preface, just a few pages. It kind of sets the stage for my journey and for the book. I grew up in a typical small town Midwestern home in the 1970s and 1980s. My parents struggled financially. My older sister and I argued and made up on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. We went to church. I had to help clean the house every Saturday, keep my room neat, and help with the dishes. I read books year-round, rode my bike in the summer, and watched Little House on the Prairie every week. I learned a little bit about my dad's Polish heritage and almost nothing about my mom's mom, who moved to the United States from Norway as a child. I played piano and trumpet, did well in school, and graduated as valedictorian from the Catholic high school I attended. I also spent my childhood pretending that our family didn't have a darkness that ate away at all of us. I didn't have the words to explain to myself or to others that I was growing up with an emotionally and verbally abusive father. Much later, I became aware that this experience made my childhood fairly typical too. I realized that beneath the surface of lots of families, there is something we resist naming, behaviors we accept as normal that have long-term consequences for the child, the family, and the next generation. I learned that my dad's struggles with mental health, self-loathing, and doubt, while not universal, are not as rare as we thought they were. After my dad died of cancer, despite the liberation and relief I felt, something kept drawing me back to memories of him. I was grieving a man I called Daddy my entire life, although I did not feel the warm, fuzzy, connected feeling the nickname might imply. I had heard and read a lot about grieving, especially from a Christian standpoint, because of my dad's work with older adults and their families. But within all the advice he had talked about, all the memoirs and books I picked up, I saw no reflection of my experience and my feelings. I don't miss him, and I feel guilty admitting that. Sometimes I do miss him, and that confuses me. When I couldn't find a book to guide me, I began to write about my own experiences and complex feelings. I wrote about what connected me and my dad and what he taught me, the Catholicism of my youth, our musical abilities, our love of reading, our belief in women's equality. I wrote about the darker aspects we shared, our depression and our self-hatred, and I wrote about what separated us for 4 years, including that same Catholicism, a separation that meant my parents missed my wedding, that's that photo, and the birth of my first child. To help me, I turned to what might contain hints of his thoughts and feelings, his journals, disjointed computer files, printed out copies in a drawer, handwritten entries in notebooks, notes and books he'd left behind, random slips of paper with poems he'd begun to write, half-completed musical compositions. And I spoke again and again with my sister and my mom, unraveling and then knitting a truer narrative of our lives together. Writing this memoir allowed me to let go of not grieving his death. Still, I came to recognize that the absence of grief still includes pain. I came to accept that his death brought both gain and loss. I know now that I am not the only person who wrestles with this cousin of grieving, this ungrieving. My dad left me a strange legacy, an ongoing fractured relationship with someone who can't contribute to fixing it. My unbroken and eternal tie to my father still exists, tethering me to the relationship I had with him. I keep working on it. I keep trying to understand. So that's the preface of the book, and it just kind of, boy, I'll tell you, it doesn't look anything like the preface I originally wrote, which wasn't in the first 6 versions of this book, so it doesn't really matter. So how many of you are writers or write anything ever, journal or anything? Yes, you know what I'm talking about. Like what you write is never what you share, and maybe there's 16 versions of it along the way. So that sort of sets the stage and hopefully helps you understand a little bit of the complex feelings that I was dealing with when my dad died. So that was 12 years ago, a little over 12 years ago. And basically what happened is I started writing almost immediately after he died. About a week after he died, I was not able to fall asleep, and I decided to get up and start writing. That's what I do. I write to process my feelings. And I started to write because I was afraid I was going to forget what happened when he died. I was in the room when he died, and I was so afraid I was going to forget that. And I also didn't understand why I wanted to remember it. And I was feeling all these complex feelings about, like, I don't miss him. He was incredibly cruel to me at different times. He was verbally abusive to me. Why do I keep crying? Why am I standing in the shower sobbing in the morning because he's gone? I'm just lost and adrift. So I started to write to try to find my way out of these feelings and through these feelings. And then I just kept writing. And then I actually shared some early drafts with Dr. Amy Redinger, who was up here just a little bit ago, with Dr. Crystal Hendrick, who works at Bay College as well. And I'm deeply grateful to both of them because it's very difficult to share what we write, right? Especially something raw and real. And both of them said, essentially, keep writing. And so I did. And I kept writing and writing. And 12 years later, there's a lot of life that happens, right? So we don't get this nice linear path And it also took a long time for me to just grapple with the healing of it. So what I ended up doing, and the structure of this, as I worked to go from memory to memoir, right? So memoir is a different kind of book. It doesn't just tell what happened. It reflects on what happened. It doesn't just tell stories, but it should tell stories. And when I initially wrote it, it was a lot of essays. And I gave it to a writing coach who said, "You write really good essays." And I said, "Thank you." And she said, "Nobody wants to read just essays." And they pick up a memoir, and I was like, oh. So after crying a lot, she said, "You know, what you need to do is put your writer in the moment with you." And I was like, "Well, I don't remember everything exactly." And she said, "That's okay. You're just writing, you know, the gist of it. You're trying to capture the spirit of it." So I said, "Okay, that's good." So then I started to put myself in these moments from my childhood, and I would talk to my mom and I would talk to my sister. I'm very lucky both of them are on this journey with me, and they see who my dad was for real. And that's not always the case in families, but I'm very fortunate that way. So I can remember a lot of times I'd sit on my back porch, tears streaming down my face, because I'd immerse myself in this moment from my past, and these were not pleasant moments to revisit. So I want to share one of those with you now, just a portion of it. So the book is set up where it kind of alternates between these stories that start when I'm a child and move through until after my dad's death, or right at his death, and then it alternates with essays that reflect on different parts that kind of start with my dad's death and then kind of meander through time. So I did what the writing coach told me, and I wrote stories, and then I also kept some essays. So, because you know, she didn't say to get rid of all of them. So what I'm going to read, and I chose this one because I'm here on a college campus. Not all of you are 20 years old, and that really doesn't matter, because these moments can happen to us at any age. But when I went to the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, I had the opportunity to get free counseling, like students at most colleges do now, right? Including here at Bay College. And I took advantage of that. My dad was very scared that I took advantage of that. I told him, because in an emotionally abusive, manipulative, controlling relationship, you tell that person everything, even when you shouldn't. And so I told my dad I was getting counseling, and he was not happy about that, but I did anyway. I also went to group counseling, and that was really interesting. So these are a couple of pictures of me from college age. What I think is important to call out here is what depression can do to your mind and how it can warp you. I believed, and I firmly believed, that in this photo at this time I was significantly overweight. I firmly believed that. I was not, right? But depression and all of that just messes with our minds and our perspectives. So this is a story from when I was 20. And in group counseling. I'm sitting in the soft light of the group counseling room in the now familiar circle of fellow college students, looking for answers and help. There's the cute guy in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the waist down, whose eyes I dread meeting because I'm convinced he'll read my attraction there and laugh at me for hoping he would reciprocate the interest. There's the young girl with lots of tattoos and piercings who looked so tough that I couldn't relate to her until last week's session, when she fell apart in tears over her sister's terminal illness. There's the therapist leading the group, maybe 30 years old, a young guy who also makes me feel uncomfortable because he's good looking. Right now, I study everyone's shoes around the circle as the leader asks us to consider what we might share from our week. For example, did you have any incidents that really upset you, or a dream you find interesting? My ears perk up at the word dream, and I'm back 3 nights ago in my dorm room bed. The group leader has seen my head move. Jennifer, do you have something? All eyes turn to me. I haven't spoken much in group yet. I told them about my family on the first night and a little bit about my depression and thoughts of suicide. I talk more in my individual counseling sessions, where my counselor, a blind woman in her 50s, sits in a comfy chair, her guide dog at her feet. In this circle, everyone can see me, and I feel exposed. Besides, I don't really know what to share most weeks. Do you blame everything on us? My dad asked me recently. Is it all my fault and your mom's fault, this depression of yours? Yes! I wanted to scream. But that wasn't the whole truth. I just wanted to hurt him. No, of course not, I replied. What do you talk about then? I don't know, my feelings, how I view myself, why I think an A- is a sign of my failure as a human being. But here in group counseling, I don't want to talk about my perfectionism or my depression. All my problems seem so silly and small compared to theirs. But this dream I'd had, that was interesting enough, perhaps. Sure, I say. The group leader leans forward and puts his hand up by his ear to encourage me to speak up. Sure, I repeat. I had a dream the other night that troubled me. I pause to gather courage and take a deep breath to speak loud enough to be heard. In the dream, I'm at home. I'm down in my parents' bedroom, which is at the opposite end of a hallway that starts in our kitchen. I pick up speed as I imagine myself back in the dream. Their bedroom is in between mine and my sister's. In this dream, my sister is lying on the floor and I'm sitting astride her. I have this huge knife in my hands and I'm stabbing it into her chest over and over. My voice trembles a bit and I look at everyone's shoes again so I can't see how they might be reacting. The horror I felt when I woke up after the dream returns. I hear the door to the garage open at the other end of the hallway and I know my dad's home. I look at my sister's dead body and the blood all around it and I think to myself, my dad's going to be so mad at me for this mess. Tears come to my eyes as I feel an overwhelming sense of fear. Most of the people in the circle chuckle, and I look at the group leader who has a smile on his face too. Seems like a strange reaction you imagine your dad having, yes? I think about it and smile a little. I guess. What I don't understand, I start to cry, is why I would hurt my sister in my dream. I love her. She's always there for me. I would never hurt her on purpose. The guilt I've felt since I woke up from the dream washes over me again. It's quiet for a moment. I should have kept this to myself. Maybe it wasn't as relevant or interesting as I thought. Wait a second, says the girl with the tattoos and piercings. Didn't you say once that you and your sister look a lot alike? I nod. So how do you know the girl you're killing is your sister? Huh? My tears stop and my brain engages. What if the girl you're killing is you? And you actually think that if you were to kill yourself, your dad would mostly be angry about the mess it would leave behind. I look up to meet the girl's eyes. I can see the group leader nodding his head. What do you think, Jennifer? He asks. Wow, I guess that fits how I feel. When I'm feeling like ending it all, I usually figure my dad wouldn't care. Do you really think that's true? The girl asks. Do you really think he wouldn't even miss you? Sitting here in the dim light in this circle with people who are looking at me with concern, I know that many people would miss me. But when the darkness consumes me, when I'm convinced I don't contribute to the well-being of anyone or anything, when I know in my soul that I am hideous inside and out, it's not that obvious. I'm so glad I don't have to deal with what you have to deal with, the young man in the wheelchair says to break my silence. What? I say with incredulity, meeting his eyes before I think about it. I mean, sure, I had the accident that put me here. He taps the armrest of his chair. But I don't ever remember hesitating on whether my dad would miss me if I were dead. I always knew he would. Always. It must suck to sometimes question whether your own dad values you or not. I look around the circle at the other students nodding their heads. I mean, part of me knows he'd miss me if I killed myself, I say. But part of me also thinks he'd be angry with me for the mess I'd leave behind, how people would talk about it, about him, see it as his failure. And I also know he once told me that part of him regretted having kids, that we changed what was possible in his life. Whoa, one girl responds. I guess that's not normal, I say with a small smile. Now almost everyone is shaking their heads no. So Jennifer, the leader says in a wrap-up voice, what does all that say to you? I think for a minute and then dare to meet his eyes too. Maybe I need to think more about my relationship with my dad if I want to feel better. Sounds like something to follow up on in your individual sessions, yes? I nod. I smile weakly at everyone around the circle, feeling supported by their presence, even though I know I'll do the rest of the thinking alone after I leave them. So definitely, group counseling, yes, very helpful, right? I mean, when I think back, that is one of those watershed moments where I understood more deeply something fundamental about my relationship with myself, with my dad. And I don't know that a counselor would have seen it or been able to draw it out. And I don't know that it would have mattered as much as hearing these people my own age or that I felt connected to, validating and questioning and pushing and challenging me. So group counseling can be very scary. If you're ever given that opportunity, it can be very, very scary to do that. But I have no regrets whatsoever, and I think it can be incredibly powerful led in the right way. But I do think very strongly, and it's very important that, that we think about like what can an individual counselor do for you. And I've had a lot of different counselors in my journey. Sometimes I've gone in for mental health tune-ups, and sometimes I've gone in for a specific issue. And certainly I've had some great counselors that I connected with, and sometimes I've had counselors I didn't connect with very well. And a good counselor will not mind at all if you say, I'm going to look for somebody else, right? Because they know it's about that fit and it's about that connection. My dad didn't get a lot of counseling. My dad was very, very religious, very spiritual, and he did seek help through religious and spiritual counseling at different times in his life, seeing a woman named Sister Myra a few times, or a few different times during his life. Unfortunately, from what I can tell from reading his journals, that wasn't the kind of counseling that was really doing him the good that it needed to do. That's not to say that spiritual counseling doesn't have value, but he had a very complicated relationship with the divine, and he always felt like he was inadequate when he was in the presence of God. And so when he went to spiritual counseling, it was inherently focused on his failings. He was never able to get to a point where he had value or he had worth. And you have to be able to get to a place where you believe you have value and worth, or you won't be willing to put the time in to make things better for yourself, right? That's sort of like a fundamental foundational piece of that. So in writing about him and writing about our depression, I spent a fair bit of time trying to put myself back in, because I haven't struggled with clinical depression for about 20, 25 years now. But I needed to go back into that mindset. So I read some of my own journals. I read a lot of his journals, thought a lot about it, talked to my sister about it, tried to remember what it felt like, and wrote a series of essays throughout the book that kind of compare and contrast the depression that I felt with what my dad struggled with. There were some really important moments when I would read something in his journal and it would help me understand myself and understand him. And understand what he had needed but did not get. So I do, as the last thing I wanted to read was a little bit longer essay, but I'm just going to read excerpts from it. But it's called Seeing in the Dark, and it really focuses on my dad's depression, what it did to him, to us, what I've learned about it, and a brief moment where things were better. In my 19 years teaching at the University of Wisconsin-Marinette, I had more than just a few students in my office in tears, talking about their battles with depression or other mental illnesses. They seemed to see me as a safe person to whom they could turn when life had become too much. In most of those situations, and with colleagues and friends, I recommend a counselor and try to normalize their tears by sharing my own experiences. I try never to compare our journeys, just to share enough of my own to give them hope that someone can survive these feelings and even get rid of most of them. I tell people that they deserve help, that they deserve to feel better because they are worthwhile and valuable. On his good days, my dad used to tell me that God doesn't make junk, that although we are all flawed, we are also amazing creatures. On his good days, he used to tell me he was proud of me, and I know he meant it. I wish when people had told him he was amazing, that he could have believed them. I wish he had been able to see his own value more clearly. It might have helped him work on seeing his way out of the darkness. His journals teach me that his depression was often debilitating, preventing him from going to work on time, staying there all day, doing what he knew he needed to do at his job or at home. He asked himself, why do I continue to succumb to the darkness? What can I do to begin a real commitment to life? His mind wandered to suicide more than once. The time goes so fast, I feel overwhelmed. I guess I'm in the blackness again because I'm bored and the future doesn't appeal to me. I hope I'm not in too deep trouble right now because although it repels me, the thought of ending it all occurs. Scary. I was surprised when I first read those words in his journal about 3 years after he died. I stopped reading but kept rocking the porch chair. I looked up at the bright summer world around me and then reread his words, uncertain if I had interpreted them correctly. It It was easy enough to transport myself and inhabit my dad's sense of failure, of aching loneliness, of despair. I just had to remember those moments in which I had questioned the very validity of my own existence. When depression consumed me, I thought about suicide a lot, and it became a comforting thought. Now, when I think about dying, I panic. I see that panic as a gift, a reminder that I no longer suffer from the perspective-altering mental illness I battled for so many years. And again, I didn't know that my dad was suicidal. We didn't know. He didn't talk about anything. He didn't talk about feelings. He reacted and was very angry and emotionally abusive and manipulative, but he didn't tell us, I feel depressed. He didn't want to admit that. And at one point, he really struggled with that. My dad struggled to define himself as someone who suffered from depression and never once articulated to me or in his journals any possibility that there was something else, something even deeper wrong. He wrote after a fight we had, apparently a particularly destructive one, "Even now, as I write the word depression, I feel so hurt and destroyed. For it's like they, Karen and Jennifer, think I am responsible for it, that I am in it. They really do not understand." In the same entry, he said, "They have left me with the perception that I am an evil person in need of help, that I am not a person they want to be around, and that I am not a person they feel they can get close to." Part of me nods and feels that we communicated clearly with him. Not that he was evil, as that was his perspective and not our words, but that he needed help, that we couldn't get close to him, and that we didn't want to be around him. Part of me feels so sad for him because of his pain at our response, and because he just didn't see his own illness. He danced around the diagnosis of depression, tried to deny its existence inside of him, and avoided his role in fighting. He met with a longtime family friend who was also a priest, and the priest gave him homework designed to help him feel better. He avoided it. He said it was too much work. Then, a few months after he mentioned starting to see Sister Myra regularly, he wrote that he ought to reach out to her again. I realized that he didn't stick with those sessions for very long. Really, when a person is depressed, they don't want to talk and almost cannot talk. Maybe she had asked him to talk about a level of darkness he wouldn't visit. My dad clawed his way out of the pit once. There's an amazing 2-year period, 1997 and 1998, when his writings include the most lucid and direct explanation of his feelings I've ever read or heard from him. During those 2 years, he was a healthy person, exploring his feelings, his experiences, and his thoughts in a coherent and productive manner. The cloak is torn away, and I can see the real person underneath. He was on an antidepressant that entire time. He had started seeing Sister Myra again on a regular basis, and his parents were both deceased. I can't help but imagine the latter had a helpful effect. His toxic relationship with his dad and challenging one with his mom were at rest. Perhaps he finally felt unshackled by his dad's death, able to explore who he truly was without risk. He still beat himself up for overeating and talked about his food addiction, but he treated it like a problem he needed to solve. He still had self-doubts and work conflicts and flare-ups of temper, but he wrote about how he later apologized to coworkers or compromised over conflicts, something simply not possible in other years. There are entries where he moved from a place of despair to a place of hope on his own, just by talking himself through his feelings. Sometimes he wrote about spending too much money on computer programs, but then he pivoted and mentioned how he used them for so much good. He talked about a tiff with my mom, but only later, when he could also say how they worked it out together. I'll tell you, reading these entries, it's like a different person than I knew. So eagerly, I reread these years. I encounter him in these pages, not in the darkness, which fills so much of the rest of what he wrote, but instead in a place of greater clarity. I find myself in conversation with him as a human being. I feel good about these accomplishments, and tonight, in a strange way, I feel I am able to accept myself a tiny little better, in that I recognize some of my own good work, some of my own accomplishments. Not that for a moment I can forget that all of this is the result of your gifts and the gift of the people around me. Still, I see myself as responding to your call, at least a little bit. He wrote to God a lot in his journals. Thanks be to God, antidepressants and therapy, which together brought him to this moment of self-acceptance. And then this moment of grace recurs, wonder of wonders, weeks later, taking a different form, one of an intense self-awareness, a sense of his own personal growth. Another point that occurred to me tonight, and it has occurred off and on of late, is that my need for approval seems to be growing less strong. I think that is good. Too much of my dad is in me. At least I sense this as being him. I have to impress people. That is my need. That was his need. Then it becomes old and I have nothing more to say. How sad. Perhaps I can still change myself in this respect. I think it is already happening, but ever so slowly. Nothing is going to be done of any consequence unless I do it when it comes to my life. No one can live our lives for us. I think about my own journey out of the darkness around that same time. When I was working on my master's degree in Duluth, Minnesota in the mid-1990s, I sat in a counselor's office talking about all the work I'd done to get better, but how I still struggled with the same issues and feelings. She asked me a question that startled me. Who is Jennifer if she is not someone who suffers from depression? I realized I had no idea. I had identified myself by my depression for over a decade. She challenged me to think about creating a self that was a survivor of depression. The work to do so took me at least another decade, and in some ways, it's still in process. For my dad, a few routine journal entries after his brief moments of self-awareness and self-esteem, this awakened section of his journals ends. I've read the rest of the pages he wrote or typed, and they're not like these. I know the rest of the story. Had he turned a corner in his self-development? Perhaps. The path he took later, including returning to graduate school for a second master's degree, is probably evidence of his growth, of his ability to value himself more deeply, to face his demons. But there were also the times when he took himself off antidepressants without his doctor's permission, or the time a few years after these journals when he was first diagnosed with cancer and they didn't give him his antidepressants in the hospital after surgery, and days later he was so unbearable to be around that I sat in the car with my mom and my sister sobbing, not wanting to go back in to see him and endure his viciousness. There were caustic emails, hurtful remarks, intense mood swings, belittling comments about my mom, and many ugly days. Unlike a happy movie where the rest of his life was lived out in deepening self-awareness and honest dialogue, the window closed most of the way. I share the unusual entries with my sister, my mom, my husband Jason. Together we marvel that he was able to value himself at all. I think they are less in awe because they have not read the hundreds of other pages filled with ever-present self-deprecating comments. I find myself wondering if I could have done more to encourage him. What did he think of the Jennifer I created, who was no longer suffering from depression, but was instead a survivor of it? Was he envious or hopeful? If he could have stayed out of the darkness longer, how much better could our lives have been? In our experiences of depression and suicidal thoughts, my dad and I share a deep connection. I go back to that dark place in my mind sometimes, briefly, like a tourist now, so that I can better understand him. I take him by the hand and wander around, but if I move back into the light, I can't see him anymore. I don't know who he could have been. He didn't either. I go back sometimes to the shared pain so that my empathy for him grows a tiny bit. And then we part ways. The truth is that I chose to get help, to act, to fight and fight and fight, while he embraced inaction. He didn't end his life, but after he had colon cancer the first time, he didn't go back for the required checkups that might have caught it spread to his lungs a little sooner. He didn't stay on antidepressants. He didn't see a counselor on a regular basis. He wasn't doing everything he could. I'm not so naive as to believe that my dad chose to suffer. He didn't choose to grow up in a society that discourages men from expressing their feelings. And he also didn't completely ignore the possibility that he had treatable mental illnesses. He took antidepressants off and on, and I know he read about depression and treatment. Maybe he was so deeply mired in the darkness that he couldn't see the problem clearly or see a way out. Maybe he tried other counseling and it failed and he didn't write about it. Maybe once some counselor or doctor suggested a diagnosis more specific than depression and it scared him. Maybe his insurance didn't cover it, at least not fully, and he didn't value himself enough to spend the money and go into debt to pay for it. Maybe he felt ashamed to admit his mental illness because it's just not something you talk about. Considering myriad maybes, I feel sorry for him that he suffered, and sorry for us that we did too. I wish people talked about depression in the open, and supportive way that we talk about other illnesses, the way we talk about cancer, for instance. Bob has depression. He deserves to feel better and be healthy. Let's get him the help he wants and deserves. I wish men bought and sent greeting cards to each other that normalized seeking counseling. Good luck in counseling, dude. You are going to kick depression's ass. Complete with a picture of a donkey on the inside and a cartoonish guy kicking its butt. What if the TV shows my dad watched had shown men going to counseling and not as a joke to save their marriage from some trite miscommunication issue? What if the society that surrounded my dad had made it seem normal for him to discuss his feelings? What if his employers, including the Catholic priests for whom he worked, upon learning of his illness, had given him paid time off and paid for his counseling? What if we began to see the cancer of the soul that is depression? I wonder if he would have had the strength to walk the path to light that would have opened to him. I'd like to think he would have. So, one of the biggest compliments that I've gotten about the book that I put out there was that it resists closure. I don't have the answers. I don't have any more answers. I write in the end of the book, I'm not even sure, what did I learn? Right? Well, I learned a lot, but I don't have answers. I didn't find closure. I didn't forgive my dad, and now I live in peace and harmony, right? I talk in the book at one point about how I get angry over and over again, and I'm okay with that. I can forgive and be angry again. I am a spiritual person, and I do think that that is what the divine is okay with. I don't think the divine asks me to just say, like, that's okay. I'm going to just let that go. It is a part of who I am. What he did was not right. I don't have to be okay with that. And I can be strong and at peace and still be mad at him sometimes. My sister and I talk about what he would think of all this. And I say to her, what do you think? What do you think Daddy would think of me, like, going out in public and talking about this or writing this book? And she laughs and she's like, oh, you know what he'd think. And that haunts me, right? I wanted to, in the book and in these conversations, I want to do the best I can to honor him. But honoring our parents doesn't mean lying about what they did. Honoring our parents means recognizing them as human beings, holding them accountable for their mistakes, their flaws, holding them accountable for what they did and how it hurt us, and then also recognizing that we are not them, right? And that I am me and he was him and his life was about him. He did some tremendous good in the world too. Later in life, he was a counselor to a lot of older adults. Later in life, he did prison ministry. He did great things. He was not an evil person to me. He gave me a tremendous amount of good things too. That's what makes it so complicated. It's why I sometimes miss him, even though I don't miss him. And boy, I really don't want him to come back now and see this, because I don't want to have that conversation. I don't have the emotional energy left for that one. But I do think that I'm honoring him, and what my sister has helped me to see is that I honor his memory by giving his experience voice too, or I'm trying to. He wrote on somewhere, I think it was on the cover of one of his journals, if I die, throw this in the lake. Well, I know he didn't mean that, literally. I know that he had time to throw his journals away, and I know he didn't. I know he had shared pieces of them with me while he was still alive. And I know in his journals, there's this periodic call of, does anyone care? Does anything I've written matter? Does anything that I've lived and suffered matter? And so part of what I'm trying to do through the book is give meaning to his suffering and to say, Daddy, I'm going to put it out there and I'm going to plead with other people. If you or somebody you know feels like that, then get help. Ask, raise your hand, cry in front of somebody. And he said, it's hard to talk. Yeah, it is. But sometimes you don't need words, right? You just need to do that. But we need to write, we need to talk about our mental health. And we need to not expect it to be some happy, fuzzy Hollywood ending, because that just doesn't exist. But we can be better. We can be healthier, right? I feel good about myself. Like, I can say that. I feel good about myself. I'm actually working on that too. I'm working on owning my own accomplishments, right? And that is not easy. It is not easy to market a book. I'll tell you that. When you are an introvert who doesn't have great, I mean, it's hard to be like, look at me, I wrote a book. Don't you want to spend money on it? This is not a pleasant feeling sometimes. If I'm getting better, look at me, I'm doing it. I just did it, right? It's hard, but I'm telling you, the journey is worth it. So if you are in a place of pain, or if you know someone who is, it is so worth it to walk that journey. And I ask you to walk it in honor of my dad, so that his suffering had meaning, so that you have value. So I just want to remind you again that there are so many resources available to you and to other people. It would be scary to call 988. Sure, it would be. Absolutely, because you don't know who's going to pick up on the other end, right? But if you or someone else you know is thinking about suicide, then you just call a number, and then you just go from there, right? They'll take care of it. They know what they're doing. All you have to do is know those numbers and know how to dial them, all right? What does it take to make an appointment with one of these lovely people? Well, you could scan the QR code, or you could just ask someone, or you can find information anywhere on the website. You could walk up to your instructor or to a staff person. If you're a staff person or a faculty member here, are there EAP resources? Sure. There always are EAP resources. So if you're a student and you're worried about a faculty or staff member, don't worry, they've got resources too. We take care of our staff at community colleges and technical colleges across this country. And then of course we've got Renee. So I definitely want to let you know that if you want to know more about me, and we do have a few minutes for questions, if you have any questions, and all questions are fair game, but you can find more information about me on my website. I do write a blog, and I started the blog last spring. I've always wanted to write a blog, but I didn't really know how to do that. And then through this whole journey, some people helped me figure that out. And it's been really helpful for me as a writer, because once you start to publish a book, you don't have a project you're working on right away. So the blog has kept me writing. So that's been good. So you can see blog posts out there. Some of them are related to the book, some of them aren't at all. And then you can follow me on Facebook or Instagram or on LinkedIn. If you are a student, I especially love linking with students on LinkedIn, because that's a great platform for you as you develop a professional presence. It's great to link to people like me, because I always link to students, right? And then that connects you to my whole network. And if you're not familiar with LinkedIn and you're a student, just ask an instructor or somebody on the campus, or just go on. You're all digital savvy, you'll figure it out. It's not hard. You could maybe tell the staff person how to do it, or the faculty member. We like being taught technology from nice, kind young people. So, are there any questions or any, what do you need? I don't know where it went.
Oh, Mariel has it.
Mariel has it. Excellent. So, are there any questions?
I was just going to say let's actually thank Jennifer for
Thank you.
I will come around with a mic for questions,
All
but
right.
I also want to start by saying I obviously read early drafts, but as I was sitting here, I was thinking of how appreciative I am of the vulnerability that it took, not to stand here. I mean, yes, that too, but to read your father's journals. Yeah. And I was thinking about that, my own parents. I was like, I wouldn't want to, right? Like, it just seems so vulnerable. So,
yeah. Well, I think
part
of what started it was we had that 4 years of estrangement. And so I started reading them to try to find out what he was thinking. Because for 4 years, we were radio silent. So I was like, what was going on in his mind? And he didn't write much during those 4 years. So I never really found out. But that's what started it. And then it kind of just became addictive, both addictive and horrific. And I would spend some time, like Jason, my husband, would learn that I'd be like sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, and I'd be reading, and like 20 minutes into it, he'd just wander into the kitchen, and I'd be sitting there, tears streaming down. He's, "Are you done for tonight?" "I think I'm done for tonight. I can't read anymore," because it's really hard. Yeah.
Questions, comments. I'll come back to you, Renee. I've got one in the back. This is the part of the day where I get my steps in. Hello, it's nice to see you again.
All right. So what I wanted to ask was, as you were writing this book, which essay or story was the most difficult one for you to write and actually put out there and keep in the final manuscript for the published book?
That is such a good question. Well, I think it was actually harder to cut things than it was to leave them in, because you write things and you become attached to them, right? And you think, this is what tells this best, but it isn't. And so you have to cut it, or no one would read it because it's too long then. I think some of them, probably the one that is the hardest still for me to read and kind of makes me emotional is the one where I was, after college, I moved back home for about 6 months. And my dad was in a really bad place, and he was super controlling. And he refused to I was 22 years old, and he refused to let me go to a movie alone. And I felt just completely trapped. And going back to that, I remember those feelings. It was awful. And I did threaten to harm myself that night. And so I had to write about that. And trying to put yourself back in that space of wanting to harm yourself is really difficult to do. And I also worry about putting that out there, because if people read that and then close the book and set it away, right, they don't see. So I think that was probably one of the most conflicting ones for me and most difficult to write down. Yeah. Great question. Thank you.
You said you have 2 children.
Yes.
So how are you managing the conversation with them? Have they read the book? Have you discussed the book with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I laugh because my kids are old enough to have read this book, but they are not readers. So I keep telling them, people might ask you about stuff like, you're in the book. Don't you want to know what I said about you? That's all right. So they're 17 and 14. My 17-year-old is trying to read it, but he's not a reader, and he's got a lot of schoolwork. So I understand. It's all good. I love both my boys. They're amazing. So I was very careful in the book to put things, most of the stories or pieces about them are when they were younger, so they're mostly little cute stuff or, poignant things. Both of my boys, of course, are normal teenage boys, right, who struggle with emotions and struggle with expressing them. And so what we've talked about depression and suicide with them from very early days, because both my husband and I struggled with it. So we were aware there's probably a genetic component, or there might be. So we've talked to them pretty openly about that all along. And my husband regularly tells them that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so that's a phrase that's burned in their minds, right? That hopefully comes to mind when the moment is dire and we're not there, because that's the part that terrifies parents most, right? It's been interesting too for me as a parent of children and worrying about them to think about what my parents felt, right? And I write in the book about how I always worried about my mom, and I always felt guilty about my mom. And I always felt bad when I would express my depression and that to my mom. I never worried about my dad. And I think it's because I think somewhere deep down I knew he knew. I knew he understood what I was feeling. And so I didn't have to worry about him. He got it. My mom didn't understand, and so was like, well, what are you doing? Why do you feel this way? Why do you want to harm yourself? I don't understand. But I think deep down I knew my dad was silently nodding and saying, oh, I get it. I feel that, right? So we've talked about that a lot with the kids, and and one of the themes of the book is parenting, right? Just because I worry about doing the things to my kids that were done to me, and I'm doing different things. My kids are going to go to therapy for different reasons than why I went, but they're going to go to therapy, right? Because going to therapy is normal and natural, because life is hard and it's full of pain for everybody. So I think that's, what we've been telling them too, is just don't be like grandpa. When you need help, seek help. Yeah.
I also want to invite questions from on Zoom. If there's anyone on Zoom who'd like to ask a question, you could unmute and go ahead and ask the question. I believe that's possible. I'm looking at Scott. Is that possible, Scott?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions from on Zoom? Any questions in the room? Additional questions?
First of all, thank you for writing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So much. And I am curious about your mom. in all of this. She was married to your dad, right? They were, in theory, a team. What has her response to your journey been?
Yeah. I took my mom for a haircut this morning, and she was asking me again what I was doing this afternoon, and I told her, and she's like, "That is such a good book. I'm so glad you wrote it." She tells me that all the time. "That is such a good book. That is so well written." So my mom thinks my book is amazing, right? She does. From the beginning, it was very interesting. About, I would say, 6 months or a year after my dad died, we were at a restaurant out, and she just kind of looked at me and said, "Yeah, I don't miss your husband, I don't miss Daddy, right? I don't miss him." And she looked at me kind of like, "Is that okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't either." I don't have to worry anymore when I call. I don't have to like dread coming over here because he's gonna explode at me because like I walked wrong or I don't know what, right? Like I don't have to have him berate me about my kids or my parenting or anything, right? Like I can just come see you. It's awesome, Mom. And she's like, "Oh, okay." Then it took her several more years for her to be willing in public to say to other people, and she was at a church kind of Bible study group one time, and she said to a bunch of people, "Yeah, my husband was pretty verbally abusive." And she said that somebody else looked at her and went, "Yeah, I know somebody else like that." And she went, "Really?" And so she just kind of relaxed, and she came back and she said, "Well, I told people that. Is that okay?" And I'm like, "It's great. Like you were yourself. You were honest. How did it feel?" She's like, "Felt good." So she's now 87, and we moved her closer to me about 6 years ago, so I see her quite regularly, and she still has anger, she still has frustration. I think she went through a period of depression in part because like you realize I wasted all this time on this guy, but she's not wasting time now. She watches what she wants to watch, and she's reading what she wants to read, and she just enjoys her life to the best that she can. And you know, she has limited mobility and all of that now as she gets older, but she's been just incredibly supportive. And again, like I recognize that is not always the case. One of the biggest things for me is that my mom and my sister acknowledged the reality that we shared. And I have so much empathy for people who don't have that, right? Because that is so often the case. And that's why, again, going to see someone who's a trained counselor is a really great idea, because your family's not going to reflect the reality that you saw, so you need to share that reality with someone else. And friends are good, but they don't, well, they might have the right degree, but they don't always have the right degree. So I've been very fortunate with my mom, and I think she told me actually just this morning that the book has helped her healing journey. So, yeah, and she's read it like I think 5 times. I mean, she's a reader. She can read a book in an afternoon, but she's read it like 5 times. I'm like, "Mom, we're gonna put this in the bedroom because I think we're done."
Scott, does the
Ding ding mean something?
dinging mean anything?
We have a question from Bridget.
Do you want me to bring you the mic so you can read the question, or is Bridget, you want to?
I'm wondering if...
Hello everybody, I'm not Bridget, I'm Brittany, but I'm using Bridget's computer.
Great.
Everyone, thank you Jennifer so much for allowing us the opportunity to sit with you. I mean, we're sitting, you're standing, but. So my question, I'm going to take our approach, is would you share with us the process of naming your memoir Ungrieving and the broken frayed rope visual? I mean, I assume it's somewhere in your book, but.
The broken rope is not in the book. Ungrieving, boy, I suck at writing titles, and I had like a really long journey with this one, and this one just came to me one morning, and I don't even really remember why. But I remember thinking, well, the book's about grieving, but it's not about grieving. It's not about normal grieving. It's like, I don't know, it's like the opposite of grieving. What's the opposite of grieving? Well, it's not the opposite. It's kind of like ungrieving. What's ungrieving? I don't know. That sounds good. That was really that was it, right? That was my thinking. So, and then the publishing house that I worked with, Mission Point Press, at one point they were like, you know, ungrieving is not really a word that anyone uses, so it's not going to show up any search terms, so that's going to hurt your sales. So you shouldn't call it that. And I'm like, but I like it. And they're like, well, why do you like it? And I said, because people are going to go, what's that? And they're like, oh, okay, arguably that's good. The reason why the "un" is off, that's thanks to my husband. He's like, when he saw the cover, he's like, you should offset the "un." And I'm like, really? I don't think so. But it turns out, like with many things, he was right. The broken rope, so somebody read it from the group, the publishing house. They read the descriptions of the book and snippets of it, and they sent back 3 covers, 2 of which I hated. This was the first one I pictured that I opened up, and I was like, that's the cover. I don't know why they read that into it or whatever, and I had sent them ideas, and my ideas were terrible. And then the subtitle, too, took a long time, and at one point it had the word estrangement in it, which we realized many people don't like or don't know, and so we just went. And then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to put emotional abuse out there, because like we talk about abuse, but we don't talk about emotional abuse, so it's just going to be right there in the subtitle, so yeah. So it's not a very interesting story but I do talk about the word ungrieving a couple of times in the book. So.
Renee, did you have a question?
Just more or less a comment.
Yeah.
I just wanted to commend you on the process of recognizing the emotional abuse and how you talked about that in at least one of the chapters of your book.
Yeah.
That a lot of people don't recognize emotional abuse.
Right.
And it seems like you, your sister, and your mom kind of talked through it and began to recognize it. And you mentioned that earlier in the conversation your mom had at church. So.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I will just tell you, though, I still struggle with it sometimes. One person reacted to the book by saying, well, it says it was about abuse, so I expected it to be pretty horrific, and it wasn't. And I was like, well, okay, so what you were expecting was physical abuse or sexual abuse, which is horrific and traumatizing in its own way. And so I do still struggle sometimes with whether I'm allowed to own the word abuse. I'm still on a journey, right? Just being very honest. But yeah, I do talk about, being able to talk about emotional and verbal abuse. For me, a big key was anyone who's in a class that you see that domestic violence wheel. If you're familiar with that, that was a key moment for me when I saw that, and I realized how many of those things fit. Not the physical, not the sexual, but the controlling, the financial, the relationships. I was like, oh my gosh, that was my dad to my mom, my dad to us, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, well then maybe that means it was abuse. But I do still struggle with that sometimes, yeah.
You mentioned the good relationship with your mother, but I'm confused. Aren't you angry she didn't protect you?
Oh, yeah. She has shared with us that she thought about leaving, and she thought about divorcing him. She did not have anywhere to go. She did not have friends because of the whole controlling nature, right? Like she was not really allowed to have friends. I think growing up, we knew that. We knew that she didn't have any options. We didn't have any options, right? We didn't feel like we did. Of course, there were, but we didn't know what they were. And we didn't have access to them. We were always very much kind of huddled together, the 3 of us, trying to protect each other. So we would, he would, be super mean to her, and we would try to deflect and try to like pull attention away, and that would of course make things worse. But I think we kind of all just felt like we were huddled together, being that way. So we just never had a sense of her being able to protect us. Truly, she did. I mean, she tried standing up to him a fair bit, but he didn't tolerate that. When you grow up in that kind of controlling household, you just come to accept that there are parameters of acceptable behavior, and standing up to him and leaving was not one of them. So we just knew that that wasn't allowed. I mean, I was 30, I don't remember anymore, but I was like 32, I think, when I finally said no. 32. And I get to decide what church I go to. I was in my 30s, right? And now I look back and I chuckle, and at the time I was like, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to tell my dad what church I go to? I don't know if I am. Am I allowed to not go home for Thanksgiving? Until I was 32, the answer was, no, you go home at Thanksgiving. I don't care what it matters to you. I don't care if it's convenient for you. I don't care if it works. We went home for Labor Day was required. Memorial Day was required. July 4th, Father's Day, Mother's Day, every birthday, you had to be at home. Even when I lived in Chicago and they were in southeastern Minnesota, even when I was working on my doctorate and I was stressed beyond belief and I had physical problems, it did not matter. You got in that car and you went. So part of the reason why we don't really have a sense of resentment at my mom is like, it just wasn't possible to do anything else from our perspective. That's that sickness that is an abusive, controlling family. Yeah. There was one more question in the back, I think, or comment.
So, what I wanted to ask, you mentioned before that there were a lot of cuts in the book. Like, there were 6 different versions, I believe you said.
That was just a random number I picked.
Was there anything that you cut in the book for the publisher's sake that you really wanted to be in the book?
Oh, well, a couple of things about that. First of all, so I went with a hybrid self-publisher, so I say what stays and goes. So that is what's awesome. A hybrid self-publisher means like they are the company, they have all the experts, they give me advice, they do all the like, here's the cover art, here's the, like I don't have to do any of that, but I say what goes in there. And then the financial risk is mine, right? So I'm happy with that because it's not about that, it's about telling the story the way I want to tell it. What I've done though with pieces that I had to cut because people eventually convinced me rightly that they didn't belong or it was too long or whatever, is I've started to use them in my blog. So like there's a blog post that I wrote about intergenerational grief that talks about some stuff with my dad and his dad and his dad and that's stuff that was all in the book, but it was too clunky to stay in there. And then to be honest with you, sometimes I'll look at things now that I had just been like, I love this. And if you're a writer, you know exactly what happens. Six months later, a year later, you're like, this is crap. What was I thinking? So sometimes I'm really grateful that I let it go and that it was cut. But yeah, I definitely, just in terms of writing, for those of you that are writers, I had no idea about the hybrid self-publishing industry. I knew about self-publishing and I knew about publishing contracts. I didn't know about this beautiful middle. Now there's a cost, right? Because you have to hire these people to do the work, but they are professionals that have decades of experience with usually traditional publishing houses. But you maintain control then, and it's wonderful. And self-publishing is great too. And you can go out and you need to do it yourself. But I didn't want to learn how to do all of that, and I didn't know how to do it. So I wasn't aware of that whole range. So yeah.
Scott, did we have anybody else on Zoom that wanted to be able to ask a question? I heard the dinging.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Wonderful.
Well, and I would just add too that if folks do have a question afterwards, if you go to the jenniferflatt.com, there's a contact me section, so you could just shoot me a question and then it comes to my email and then I just email you back and it's great. It works really well. Or you can message me through one of the other social media pieces as well. So if you think of a question later on, don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today,
thank
Jennifer.
you.
And Jennifer is going to be in the lobby today selling copies of her books. We do have additional copies in the library. I think ours is checked out right now, but there's a copy over at the Iron Mountain campus. And if you'd like to be put on the waiting list for that, we have that here. But thank you so much for being here today, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. All right. Try not to make any.
Well, what I'm wondering is, can we take